The weight of being forgotten was a physical ache in Ilara's bones, heavier than the perpetual smog that stained the city's human district, a grimy shade of grey. Every coin she earned serving ale to weary factory workers was a ghost, vanishing into a debt that was her only inheritance. She carried the loss of her family like a shroud, a constant reminder of the plague the elves across the misty river had simply ignored. Their indifference a far colder killer than any disease. This feeling of being utterly invisible, of screaming into a void, is a suffocating silence. I wonder if it feels the same where you are. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, what time it is for you right now, and please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next in this story. Her world was a cramped tapestry of cobblestone, slick with rain and refuse, the clang of machinery, and the smell of coal smoke that clung to everything. From the grimy window of the tavern, she could see it, the elven spire, a needle of impossible grace piercing the clouds, a constant, glittering mockery of her existence. It was the symbol of their power, their magic, their immortality, everything they had and everything her people lacked. She scrubbed tables sticky with spilled drinks and despair, her hands raw, haunted by the memory of her mother's fevered brow and her father's final, rattling breath. The elves had magic that could mend the very fabric of life, yet they had let an entire district of humans wither and die, separated by nothing more than a river of mist and a chasm of contempt. Beneath her exhaustion simmered a dangerous, hidden fire. Ilara didn't dream of silken dresses or a life of ease. Such fantasies were luxuries she could not afford. Her secret yearning was far more perilous. She craved a voice. A single word that could travel across the water and crack the crystalline walls of their palace. She yearned for a life that left a mark, a scar on the memory of the world, so that no one could ever again pretend she and her people had never existed. This desire was a poison and a prayer. A hopeless rebellion waged in the silent chambers of her heart as she watched the unfeeling lights of the elven city flicker like distant, cruel stars, utterly oblivious to the darkness that consumed her own. Across that river, within the cold, silent opulence of the spire, King Theron stood before a bed of woven moonlight, his power a useless, heavy crown. His kingdom, a monument to elven grace, was dying a slow, quiet death from within. A strange blight crept through their ancient forests, turning silver leaves to dust and silencing the magic in the air. But its cruelest work was here, in the form of his son. The heir to his throne, locked in a magical slumber no healer could penetrate. Theron's stoic facade, his regal calm, was a masterful lie, a mask hiding the gnawing terror of a father and a king watching his entire legacy, his own child, fade into nothingness. His immense authority was a cage, and he was powerless against the one enemy that truly mattered. One night, as the mist from the river rolled thick and cold through the streets, Ilara was making her way home, her shift finally over. The usual cacophony of the city was muffled, creating an eerie stillness. It was in this quiet that she saw him. Lying half in the murky water at the riverbank was a figure, a shock of silver hair stark against the mud-caked stones. He was an elf, his fine silks ruined, his face pale as death. But it was the strange, feverish mark blooming on his skin that made her blood run cold. She had seen that mark before, in the final, agonizing hours of the plague. It was a symbol of death that belonged to her world, and it had no business being on the pristine skin of an elven noble. The sight of the elven noble, so helpless and stained with the mark of human suffering, was a cruel paradox that twisted something deep inside Ilara. It was not pity that held her there, rooted to the muddy bank, but a ghost of memory so vivid it stole the air from her lungs. She was a child again, her small hands uselessly clutching her mother's, feeling the same unnatural heat radiate from skin that should have been cool and fair. The mark on the elf's neck was a mirror, a dark reflection of the final bloom of sickness that had claimed everyone she loved. The elves had watched from their crystalline spire as the plague scoured her district, their silence a verdict of worthlessness. Now, their pristine world had been breached by the very ugliness they had refused to acknowledge, and it had washed up at her feet, a testament to an injustice she could never forget. Her life was a monument to that loss, built from the rubble of a family and cemented with inherited debt. Every morning she woke not to the sun, but to the suffocating weight of a ledger she could never balance. The coins she earned were not her own. They were offerings to the ghost of a loan her father had taken for a medicine that never came. A desperate gamble against a fate the elves could have averted with a single whispered spell. This burden was her constant companion, a chill that seeped deeper than the river mist. It shaped her posture, stole the light from her eyes, and kept her perpetually running in place. She wasn't living a life, but surviving a sentence. Each day a repetition of the last E, with the spire across the water, serving as a constant, glittering reminder of the power that had condemned her to this existence. Romance, in such a world, was a language she did not speak and could not afford to learn. It was a fairy tale told in warm, well-lit rooms, not in the damp, cramped hovel she called home. To her, love was not a promise of salvation, but another potential wound, a vulnerability she had long since armored herself against. How could she offer a heart that was already shattered, a future that was already mortgaged to the past? A partner would mean another person to disappoint, another body to watch sicken, another loss to endure. Hope was the most dangerous currency of all, and she had spent her last reserves of it years ago by her parents' deathbeds. Now, there was only the cold, practical calculus of survival, a grim arithmetic that left no room for the tender, foolish algebra of the heart. Yet, as she stared at the unconscious elf, a flicker of something other than bitterness stirred within her. It was not compassion, not for one of them, but a stubborn, defiant refusal to be like them. Their greatest sin was their indifference, the cold, calculated decision to turn away, to leave him to die in the muck, to let the river claim him, would be to embrace the very cruelty that had defined her life. It would make her a mirror of their apathy. In a world that had given her nothing, her refusal to be like her oppressors was the only thing she truly owned. With a surge of grim determination, she knelt, her hands shaking, and reached for the noble, not to save an elf, but to salvage the last, ragged piece of her own humanity from the wreckage. Her decision was not made in a vacuum. A sudden, unnatural stillness descended upon the riverbank, silencing the distant city. Clang! From the swirling mists, two figures emerged, their forms tall and impossibly slender, their movements silent as ghosts. Elven guards, their silver armor gleamed with a soft internal light, and their eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. They did not draw their elegant, curved blades, but their very presence was a weapon, radiating an authority that froze the breath in her chest. One of them spoke, his voice not loud but carrying with absolute clarity a sound like chimes of ice. He did not ask what she was doing. He simply said, "You will come with us." It was not a request. It was the pronouncement of a fate she could not escape. Being escorted across the mist-shrouded river was like passing through the veil between the living and the dead. The thick, coal-laced air of her district gave way to an atmosphere so clean and crisp it felt alien in her lungs. The perpetual grey gloom was replaced by a soft, ethereal glow that seemed to emanate from the very stones and trees. The water beneath their silent, gliding boat was not the murky brown she knew, but a clear, shimmering silver. Everything in their world was graceful, perfect, and achingly beautiful, and it made her feel like a smudge of dirt on a flawless canvas. The filth of her life, The grit under her nails, the scent of smoke in her hair, it all felt like a profanity in this sacred space, a declaration of her own inferiority. They led her from the boat and up a winding path of polished white stone, towards the base of the spire that had haunted her entire existence. Up close, it was not merely a building but a force of nature, soaring into the heavens with an arrogance that defied gravity. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the constant noise of her world. It was the silence of power, of a place that had no need to shout its own importance. They brought her to a halt before a set of doors carved from what looked like solid moonlight. So vast they made her feel like an insect. The doors swung open without a sound, revealing a hall of impossible scale and cold, breathtaking grandeur. And there, at its center, waiting on a dais of crystal, was a figure whose regal presence radiated a power that could shatter worlds. He was the king. King Theron sat upon a throne that seemed carved from a frozen shard of starlight, a figure of such immense and ancient power that Ilara felt her own heartbeat falter in her chest. He was not merely handsome in the way of the noble she had found. He was terrifyingly perfect, his face a mask of regal severity sculpted by millennia. Long, silver hair, the color of moonlight on snow, framed features that held no warmth, only the cold, clear light of absolute authority. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, swept over her, and in their depths she saw the weight of ages, a profound stillness that made her feel like a fleeting insect. His presence was a physical force, an oppressive silence that crushed the air from the room, making her grimy clothes and human frailty feel like a blasphemy in his pristine, immortal court. The great hall was not empty. Arranged in a silent watching crescent around the dais were other elves, nobles of his court, their faces impassive, yet radiating a palpable tension. Their jeweled robes and silver armor were a stark contrast to the simple, worn tunic Ilara wore, but it was their collective gaze that truly unnerved her. It was a mixture of cold curiosity, disdain, and a thread of shared anxiety that seemed to connect them all to their silent king. She could feel the immense pressure bearing down on Theron, not just from his throne, but from his own people. They looked to him for answers, for salvation from a threat she couldn't comprehend, and their silent judgment was a palpable weight in the sterile air. He was their monarch, but he was also their prisoner, trapped by their expectations and the slow, creeping decay of their world. For a fleeting moment, as Theron's gaze passed over her and settled on some distant, unseen point, the mask of command slipped. Ilara saw it, a flicker of something raw and deeply human in the eyes of the immortal king. It was not mere weariness, but a profound, soul-deep exhaustion, the hollowed-out look of a man who had watched hope wither and die 1,000 times. It was the haunted expression of a father, not a king, a grief so potent it seemed to cool the air around him by several degrees. This crack in his perfect facade was more terrifying than his anger could ever be. It revealed a hidden desperation, a vulnerability that spoke of a powerlessness he could not afford to show, reminding her in a sickening, unwelcome way of her own father's final, helpless days. He finally spoke, and his voice was not loud, but it filled the cavernous hall as if the stones themselves were resonating with his words. "For generations we have felt it," he began, his voice a low, melodic timbre that held the sorrow of a funeral dirge. A quietening in the heart of the forest, the fading of the light within the leaves, a blight born of our own complacency, has taken root in our land, siphoning the very magic that sustains us. He gestured vaguely towards an unseen wing of the palace. It has poisoned our soil, withered our most ancient trees, and now it has claimed my son, the future of our line, trapping him in a slumber from which our most powerful healers cannot wake him. The admission was a stone dropped into a silent pool, the ripples of his failure and fear spreading through the assembled court. Theron's gaze finally locked onto Elara, and it was no longer distant but sharp, analytical and unnervingly intense. He saw not a frightened human girl, but a variable in an equation he had long failed to solve. "The noble you found by the river," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial calm, "bore a mark upon his skin, a feverish bloom our healers did not recognize. But you did. It was not a question. The sickness that scoured your district, the plague you humans endured with such resilience, is not a separate affliction. It is a cruder, more violent manifestation of the same blight that consumes us. Your mortality, your connection to the cycle of life and death we long ago abandoned, has made you a vessel for its symptoms and perhaps for its cure." The revelation struck Elara with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless and reeling. The suffering of her people, the plague the elves had ignored, was a part of their own curse. It was a shared doom. Before she could process the sheer, staggering injustice of it all, Theron rose from his throne. With a single, sharp gesture, he dismissed the entire court. The nobles filed out in a rustle of silk and a whisper of silent judgment, their disapproval a palpable force left lingering in the air. Soon, only Elara, the king, and 2 royal guards remained in the echoing silence of the immense hall. Theron descended the dais, his movements fluid and predatory, stopping just a few feet from her. His shadow fell over her, and his voice was a low, dangerous command. "Approach, human. You and I have a bargain to strike." The oppressive weight of the king's presence was a physical force, pressing down on Elara until she felt her bones might creak under the strain. He moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and predatory, closing the distance between them until she was enveloped in his shadow, breathing air that seemed to belong solely to him. His scent was of winter and cold stone, a stark, clean aroma that made the lingering smell of coal smoke on her clothes feel like a desecration. Up close, his perfection was a weapon. Every line of his face was a study in regal severity, and his eyes, the color of a gathering storm, were not merely looking at her but dissecting her, peeling back the layers of grime and exhaustion to find the core of her, the strange anomaly he needed. She wanted to shrink away, to become invisible again, but a stubborn, fiery knot of defiance in her gut held her fast, forcing her to meet his gaze. "The blight that withers my kingdom is not a disease of the soil," Theron began, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated in Elara's chest, a sound both mesmerizing and terrifying. "It is a curse of the spirit. We elves, in our long years, sought to sever our ties to the messy, painful cycle of mortality. We built a world of perfect, unchanging grace, and in doing so, we created an imbalance. We have become stagnant, a placid lake cut off from the river of life. The magic of this world requires both growth and decay, life and death." He gestured to the unseen chambers where his son lay. "My heir is the ultimate price of our hubris. His spirit is fading because it has nothing to anchor it to the living world. He is a flower in a vacuum, beautiful but dying for lack of air." His gaze sharpened, pinning her in place with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "The ancient prophecies, dismissed by my council as the ramblings of forgotten seers, spoke of this day. They warned that only a union of the 2 bloodlines, a fusion of the mortal heart and the immortal spirit, could restore the balance we so arrogantly discarded. You, human, stumbled into this fate. The plague that ravaged your people was the blight in its most raw, aggressive form, a desperate cry from the world itself. Your survival, your very presence here, is not an accident. You are an antibody produced by the world to cure a sickness it can no longer endure. You are the missing part of the equation, the chaotic, fleeting, beautiful spark of mortality that we cast aside and now so desperately need. He took another step closer, his power a palpable aura that made the air shimmer. Therefore, you and I will form an alliance, he stated, the words as cold and hard as the crystal of his throne. It will be a political contract, a ritualistic binding. You will become my queen. The proposition was so audacious, so utterly unthinkable, that Elara could only stare, her mind struggling to catch up to the reality of the words. This will not be a marriage of affection, he continued, his tone devoid of any emotion, save for grim necessity. You will be a conduit. Through our union, your vibrant, fleeting life force will be channeled into my bloodline, anchoring my son to the world of the living and purging the blight from our lands. You will be the bridge between our two worlds, the key to our salvation. He saw the disbelief and fury warring in her eyes and pressed his advantage, his voice dropping to a low, seductive register that was more dangerous than any command. In return for this service, your life will be transformed. The debt that has been a chain around your neck since birth will be erased. Your district, your people, will be placed under my direct protection. They will have elven medicine, food, and security. No human will ever again suffer from a plague we have the power to prevent. He was offering her the impossible, dangling the answer to every prayer she had ever choked back in the darkness of her hovel. You yearn for a voice, for a life that matters. I am offering you a crown. I am offering you the power to remake the world that has tried so hard to break you. All you must do is agree. The king's offer was a poisoned chalice, shimmering with a promise so potent it made her ache. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to spit in the face of this arrogant monarch who spoke of saving her people now, only when he needed something from them. The memory of her parents' fevered faces flashed behind her eyes, a fresh wave of grief and rage that threatened to consume her. Yet what was the alternative? To return to her life of silent servitude, watching her neighbors and friends struggle under the same indifferent sky, knowing she had held the power to help them and had thrown it away for the sake of her own wounded pride. This was a cruel, impossible choice. He was offering her the salvation of her people at the cost of her soul, forcing her to bind herself to the very source of her lifelong pain. A strange calm settled over her, chilling the fire of her rage into something colder and harder. Resolve. For the first time, she saw him not as an immortal king or a godlike being, but as a desperate man cornered by his own failures. He needed her. Without her, his lineage would end, and his perfect, sterile kingdom would wither into dust. The knowledge was a sliver of steel in her spine. She was not the beggar here, she was the one holding the cure. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his without flinching. The oppressive weight of his presence seemed to lessen, held at bay by the sudden, unexpected force of her will. The great hall, which had felt like a cage, now felt like an arena, and she was no longer the sacrifice, but a contender. "I accept your proposal," Elara said, her voice quiet but ringing with absolute clarity in the vast, silent hall. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even respect, crossed Theron's stoic features before being instantly suppressed. The deal was struck, the pact all but sealed. He had his solution. But she was not finished. "I accept," she repeated, taking a deliberate step forward, closing the final gap between them, until she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his ancient eyes. "But I have one condition. Before any binding, before I wear any crown, you will come with me, alone, back across the river. You will walk through the streets of my district. You will stand before the unmarked graves of the plague victims, and you will say the names of my parents, whose deaths you and your people watched in silence." The ceremony was not held in a sun-drenched temple or a hall of joyous celebration. Instead, Theron led Ilara to a stark, ancient chamber deep within the spire's foundations, a place carved from the living rock of the mountain itself. The air was cold and still, carrying the scent of damp stone and forgotten magic. There was no music, only the faint, rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the darkness. The only light came from a single, floating crystal that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the faces of the assembled council members look like grim, disapproving masks. Lord Valerius, his handsome face a study in contempt, stood at the forefront, his eyes fixed on Ilara as if she were a piece of filth sullying their sacred space. This was not a wedding, it was a sentencing, a grim ritual of necessity performed in the heart of a dying kingdom, and she was the sacrifice. Theron began the binding rite, his voice resonating in the ancient elven tongue, a language that felt like chimes of ice and the rustle of ancient leaves. The words were not of love or devotion, but of contract and obligation, a cold, legalistic litany that bound her life force to his bloodline. He spoke of balance, of mortal sacrifice for immortal preservation, his tone as flat and unyielding as the stone walls around them. When it was her turn, Ilara repeated the vows he had taught her, her voice in the common tongue sounding jarringly human, fragile, yet laced with a thread of iron defiance. As she spoke, the final word, she felt a tangible snap in the air, a cold, invisible chain locking around her spirit. The agreement was sealed. She was no longer just Ilara, she was a tool, a key, a queen in name only, bound to the very power that had allowed her family to perish. The silent judgment of the elven court was a physical weight in the room. Lord Valerius's lip curled in a barely perceptible sneer, his disdain a palpable wave of cold. To him, this was the ultimate desecration, the final, desperate act of a weakened king soiling their ancient lineage with the tainted blood of a short-lived, inferior creature. He saw not a solution, but a symptom of their decay, a stain that could never be washed away. Other, older members of the council simply looked on with weary resignation, their faces etched with the sorrow of 1,000 years. They understood the grim calculus of Theron's decision, the terrible necessity of it, but their acceptance was a funereal thing. They were mourning the end of their perfect, isolated world, and Ilara was the living symbol of their failure, a walking, breathing monument to their king's powerlessness against the encroaching dark. Though the ceremony was shrouded in secrecy, news of the king's union with a human woman spread like wildfire, carried on whispered winds across the misty river. In the smog-choked alleys of her district, the reaction was a volatile mixture of disbelief, a desperate flicker of hope, and a deep, corrosive suspicion. Some saw her as a savior, a girl from the gutter who might finally force the elves to see their suffering. Others saw a traitor, one of their own sold to their oppressors for a crown and a life of comfort. They could not comprehend the nuances of the bargain, only the stark image of a human girl ascending the spire. For Ilara, this schism was a new kind of prison. She was now utterly alone, caught in the unforgiving space between two worlds, a stranger in the elven court and an outcast to the very people she had sacrificed her freedom to save. The ritual demanded a physical seal, a conduit for the magic to flow. Theron reached for her, and Ilara flinched instinctively before forcing her hand to remain steady. His fingers, long and impossibly elegant, closed around hers. His skin was cool, smooth as polished marble, a stark contrast to her own calloused, work-worn hand. The touch was meant to be clinical, a mere formality and a magical transaction, but the contact sent an unexpected jolt of energy arcing between them. It was a current of pure life, her warmth against his coldness, her mortality a vibrant spark against his ancient stillness. For a heartbeat, his stoic composure fractured, and his storm-grey eyes widened almost imperceptibly. It was a fleeting, uncontrolled reaction. a silent acknowledgement that the barrier between them was far more fragile than either of them had believed. He did not offer her a ring, a symbol of sentiment she knew he did not possess. Instead, he lifted a delicate circlet of woven silver and moonstone from a velvet cushion. It was not the grand, jewel-encrusted crown of a queen, but something older, more potent. As he gently placed it upon her brow, the metal felt like a brand of ice against her skin. A dizzying rush of sensations flooded her mind, not her own emotions, but a faint, echoing thrum of the land's deep pain, a whisper of the blight's creeping, life-sapping cold. It was the first true taste of her new reality, the chilling confirmation that she was now a bridge, a conduit for a sickness she barely understood. The circlet was not a symbol of power, it was a yoke, and its weight was already threatening to crush her. With the rite concluded, they were left to face each other in the suffocating silence of the chamber. The contract was signed, the magic bound. All that remained were the two architects of this impossible alliance, trapped together by desperation and prophecy. For a long, breathless moment, their eyes locked, and the carefully constructed walls of regal authority and defiant survival crumbled away. In his gaze, she saw not a king, but a father haunted by the slow, silent fading of his child. In hers, he saw not a gutter-born human, but a survivor whose spirit refused to be extinguished despite a lifetime of neglect. The vast chasm of prejudice and power that separated their worlds seemed to shrink in that single, shared glance, replaced by a raw, unnerving awareness of the profound and dangerous intimacy they had just forged. As they turned to face the silent, watching eyes of the court, Theron made his first move as her husband. His hand left hers and came to rest with deliberate, possessive pressure on the small of her back. The gesture was a clear, unspoken declaration to his nobles. She was his, her position was absolute, and any challenge to her would be a challenge to him. It was a masterful political maneuver, a shield and a warning in one smooth motion. But for Elara, the touch was a searing brand through the thin fabric of her dress, the warmth of his palm. The strength in his fingers holding her steady was a shocking, deeply personal intrusion. It was a claim, a mark of ownership that felt simultaneously like a cage and terrifyingly like the first hint of protection she had felt in years. He leaned in, his silver hair brushing her cheek, his lips so close to her ear she could feel the coolness of his breath against her skin. The movement was subtle, appearing to the court as a private word from a king to his new queen. "They will try to break you," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant vibration that sent a shiver through her entire body. "They will see your humanity as a flaw to be exploited. Do not give them the satisfaction of seeing you fall." The words were a pragmatic warning, an extension of their contract, yet the sheer proximity of him was a disarming assault on her senses. The scent of winter air and cold stone. The deep timbre of his voice meant only for her. It was an intimacy so potent it threatened to shatter her composure, forging a dangerous us-against-them bond that felt far too real. To complete the public display of their union, a kiss was required. A final seal for the benefit of the watching court. Theron turned her to face him, his hands moving to her shoulders, his expression an unreadable mask of regal duty. He lowered his head, his storm-grey eyes holding hers, and for a terrifying second, Elara saw the mask slip, revealing a flicker of the immense, lonely grief beneath. Then his lips met hers. It was meant to be chaste, symbolic, and cold. It was none of those things. The instant they touched, a jolt of something primal and electric passed between them, a flash of his soul-deep weariness, a surge of her burning, defiant life force, a shared, aching loneliness that was so profound it stole the breath from her lungs. The kiss was brief, a mere whisper of contact, but it shattered the sterile illusion of their bargain. This was no longer a contract, it was a conflagration, and they were both standing at its heart. The days that followed the binding ceremony were a study in suffocating silence and charged glances. Life in the spire was not a whirlwind of royal duties, but a slow, deliberate dance in a gilded cage. Ilara and Theron shared meals in a vast, echoing dining hall. The space between them at the long, polished table, a chasm of unspoken tension. He would watch her, his storm-grey eyes analytical as she struggled with the array of unfamiliar silver utensils, a stark reminder of the world she had left behind. She was a ghost at his feast, a human anomaly in a world of perfect, unchanging grace. Every rustle of her borrowed silk gown felt like a lie, and the impassive elven servants who moved like spectres around them only amplified her profound and crushing sense of isolation. This new life was a constant, low-grade fever of anxiety, a performance for an audience she couldn't see. Their forced proximity bred a strange, dangerous awareness. They would pass each other in the long, silent corridors, the air crackling with an energy that had nothing to do with their political pact. Ilara found herself cataloguing the minute details of his existence. The way a lock of silver hair fell across his brow when he was poring over ancient texts in the library. The quiet, almost imperceptible sigh that escaped him when he thought he was alone. The sheer, weary weight of millennia she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes before the kingly mask slammed back into place. He, in turn, seemed to be studying her, not as a political tool, but as a puzzle. He noted the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her gaze would drift towards the windows, facing her old district, and the fierce, protective fire that flashed in her eyes whenever an elven noble looked at her with disdain. One evening, she found him standing on a high balcony overlooking the kingdom, the fading light painting the sky in hues of violet and rose. He did not turn as she approached, his focus fixed on the darkening land. "The blight is worst at twilight," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It is a creature of shadows. It feeds on endings." Ilara stood beside him, her gaze following his to the distant forests, which seemed to shimmer with a faint, sickly grey aura. For a moment, they were not king and consort, but two people watching their world die. "We had shadows in my district," she replied quietly, the words tasting of ash. "We just called it night." A flicker of something, surprise, empathy, crossed his features. He turned to her, the wind whipping his silver hair, and for the first time, he truly looked at her, not as a means to an end, but as someone who understood the language of loss. Her presence at the Royal Council meetings was a constant, simmering source of conflict. She was made to sit on a smaller, unadorned chair beside Theron's throne, a deliberate and public humiliation. Lord Valerius, his handsome face a mask of aristocratic contempt, took particular pleasure in undermining her. During a debate on grain distribution, he turned his cold gaze upon her. "Perhaps our new queen has some insight," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Surely her vast experience in taverns has given her a unique perspective on the management of a kingdom's resources." A wave of cruel, muted laughter rippled through the assembled nobles. Ilara felt a hot flush of shame and rage creep up her neck, her hands clenching into fists in the folds of her gown. She was a prop for their scorn, a symbol of their king's desperation. Before Ilara could voice the furious retort burning on her tongue, Theron's voice cut through the air, as sharp and cold as breaking ice. "Lord Valerius," he said, his tone dangerously soft. He did not raise his voice, but the entire council fell silent, the temperature in the chamber dropping by several degrees. "The Queen's counsel is mine to request. Her perspective is born of a world you have spent centuries ignoring, a world whose suffering is now the root of our own. You would do well to remember that her presence here is not a matter for your amusement, but a testament to your own council's failure to foresee this crisis." His eyes, like chips of flint, were fixed on Valerius, and the threat within them was unmistakable. He was not defending Ilara. He was asserting his absolute authority and protecting the integrity of his plan. But for Ilara, hearing him silence her tormentor sent a confusing, unwelcome jolt of gratitude through her. Later, in the privacy of the royal library, the silence between them was different. It was not empty, but filled with the aftermath of the council meeting. Theron stood by a window, his back to her. Valerius's family has coveted the throne for 500 years, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. He sees you not as a person, but as a weakness in my armor, an impurity he can exploit to question my rule. Do not let his words find purchase in you. They are not arrows meant for you, but stones he is throwing at my throne. He was explaining the political calculus of the court, treating her as a co-conspirator, an ally. He was arming her. He thinks I am your weakness, Ilara said, her voice steadier than she felt. Perhaps he should be more concerned that you are mine. The corner of Theron's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. The true test came during the grand autumn equinox ceremony, a formal event attended by every noble house. Ilara stood by Theron's side, a vision in silver silk, feeling like an impostor in a fairy tale. It was then that a rival lady, a cousin to Valerius, approached with a sweet, venomous smile. "Your Majesty," she said to Theron, her eyes flicking dismissively over Ilara, "we are all so relieved you have found a solution, though one wonders about the purity of a bloodline mended with such common clay." The insult was direct, a public challenge to the very foundation of their alliance. The entire hall went quiet, all eyes turning to see how the king would respond to such a brazen attack on his new queen. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, the weight of 1,000 hostile eyes pressing down on her. Theron did not hesitate. He turned, placing a deliberate, possessive hand on the small of Ilara's back, drawing her closer to his side. The gesture was a shield, a claim. He then fixed the noblewoman with a gaze so cold it could have frozen fire. "Lady Anaya," he said, his voice ringing with absolute, chilling authority through the silent hall. "You speak of purity, yet you stand in a dying land. You speak of common clay, yet it is this clay that holds the spark of life our own, pure blood has lost. This is Ilara, my wife and your queen. Her heart is the anchor that will save us from our own arrogance. If you or anyone else in this hall shows her anything less than the absolute respect she is due, you will be answering not to her, but to me. And you will find my judgment to be far less merciful than hers." The shock in the hall was a palpable thing. He had not just defended a political arrangement, he had defended her. He had called her his wife, his queen, and had elevated her mortal heart to the status of their salvation. As Lady Anaya paled and stammered an apology, Ilara could only stare at Theron's profile, seeing the hard line of his jaw, the protective fire in his eyes. The warmth of his hand on her back was a searing brand, a silent promise that reverberated deeper than his public words. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls of their contract, their pretense, were shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. The line between what was real and what was for show had not just blurred, it had been erased entirely, leaving her heart exposed and dangerously, terrifyingly vulnerable. That night, Ilara couldn't sleep. She paced the cold stone floors of her chambers, the king's words echoing in her mind. "My wife, your queen." He had defended her with a ferocity that felt deeply personal, a possessiveness that went far beyond the needs of their magical contract. She replayed the moment in her mind, the feel of his hand on her back, the chilling power in his voice. She had come to this place fueled by a lifetime of resentment, prepared to be a tool, a sacrifice, a ghost in their pristine world. She had not been prepared for this, for him. She had not been prepared for the confusing turmoil in her own chest, the slow, treacherous melting of the ice that had encased her heart for years. The question burned in her thoughts, a terrifying and undeniable truth. Were they really just pretending anymore? The political fallout from Theron's public declaration was immediate. His unwavering defense of Elara had solidified his position, but also galvanized his opposition. The more conservative factions of the council, led by a now seething Lord Valerius, saw the king's growing attachment to his human queen as a catastrophic liability. They believed his judgment was being clouded by emotion, making him reckless. They could no longer attack Elara directly without invoking the king's wrath, so they changed their strategy. They would use the very terms of the prophecy against him, twisting his solution into a new, more binding cage. They saw their opening, a way to control the king, the queen, and the future of the elven race itself through a single, inescapable demand. Lord Valerius requested an emergency session of the Royal Council, his face a grim mask of feigned duty. Theron and Elara sat upon their thrones, the air in the chamber thick with unspoken hostility. Valerius rose, his voice ringing with false reverence. "Your Majesty, your devotion to the Queen and to the letter of the prophecy is an inspiration," he began, the words like silk-wrapped daggers. "You have bound yourself to the mortal heart. You have defended her honor. But the prophecy speaks not just of a union, but of a fusion of bloodlines. A simple binding, a magical conduit, is not enough to permanently purge the blight. The Council has reviewed the most ancient texts. To truly anchor the future of our race and create a permanent bridge between our worlds, a true heir must be conceived. The prophecy demands a child." Valerius's demand fell into the stunned silence of the council hall like a block of ice, shattering the fragile peace Theron had fought to create. The words, "an heir must be conceived," were not a suggestion, but a public command, a strategic masterstroke that twisted their political alliance into a grotesque biological imperative. Elara felt the blood drain from her face, a cold wave of nausea washing over her. She was no longer a queen, not even a magical conduit. In their eyes, she was now merely a womb, a vessel for a purpose that had nothing to do with her will or her heart. She risked a glance at Theron. His face was a mask of stone, utterly unreadable. But she saw the tightening of the muscles in his jaw, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the hand that rested on the arm of his throne. He was a king in a gilded cage, and his enemies had just slammed the door shut, using her body as the lock. The walk back to their private chambers was a journey through a frozen, silent hell. The long, ornate corridors of the spire, usually a source of intimidating beauty, now felt like the sterile passages of a mausoleum. The very air between them had solidified, becoming a wall of unspoken accusations and unbearable pressure. Every echo of their footsteps on the polished marble seemed to whisper the council's decree, "Heir, heir, heir." Elara clutched her arms around herself, the borrowed silk of her gown feeling like a shroud. She was trapped, more completely than she had ever been, in the debt-ridden alleys of her home. Theron walked a pace ahead, his regal posture unwavering. But she could feel the storm of conflict radiating from him. He was her husband, her king, her defender, and now, potentially, her captor, bound by an ancient prophecy he could no longer control. The hope that had begun to dangerously bloom in her heart withered into ash. Once inside the king's private study, with the heavy doors closed, the silence finally broke. Was this always the plan? Elara's voice was a low, shaking thing, laced with the acid of betrayal. "It was saving your son, just a pretext. Was I brought here simply to be a broodmare for your fading lineage?" She turned on him, her fists clenched, the hurt and humiliation of the council meeting boiling over into pure, unadulterated rage. "You stood there and let them discuss me like I was livestock. You let them reduce this entire arrangement, reduce me, to nothing more than a means to produce a child. Tell me, Your Majesty." She spat the title like a curse. It was the part about respecting me, just another clause in our contract, easily amended when it became inconvenient for you. The raw pain in her voice was not just for the public insult, but for the shattering of the fragile, unspoken thing that had been growing between them. Theron did not retaliate with anger. Instead, a deep, soul-crushing weariness seemed to settle over him, aging him more than 1,000 years ever could. He turned from the window, his storm-grey eyes filled with a desolation she had never seen before. "No," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with truth. "That was never the plan." He moved to an ancient, locked chest and removed a scroll, its edges brittle with age. "I kept this from you, from everyone. The prophecy is more specific than I revealed. The binding ritual we performed is only a temporary measure. It funnels your life force to slow the blight, to keep my son tethered. But it is not a cure. The magic is already weakening." He unrolled the scroll, his finger tracing the faint, glowing script. "It says the only permanent solution, the only way to truly purge the curse, is the first bloom of the fused blood, a child born of both our worlds. The healers have confirmed it. The blight is adapting. We have, at most, another year." The revelation hung in the air, a devastating truth that recontextualized everything. He hadn't been manipulating her. He had been desperately trying to find another way, hiding the full, terrible weight of the prophecy from her, to spare her this exact fate. The fury drained from Ilara, leaving a hollow, aching void in its place. They were both prisoners of this destiny, shackled together by a dying land. Theron took a hesitant step toward her, the mask of the king completely gone, leaving only the haunted face of a man facing an impossible choice. They searched every archive, consulted every forbidden text, seeking an alternative, he confessed, his voice raw with a desperate sincerity that tore at her heart. "I would not force this upon you. To see you reduced to a political tool in their games, to be made a sacrifice on the altar of my family's hubris. I cannot do it." He stopped, his hand half raised as if to touch her, his gaze burning with an intensity that was far more than political. "I would rather watch this kingdom turn to dust." Before Ilara could respond, before she could process the weight of his near confession, a declaration that valued her life above his entire legacy, a sharp, formal rap echoed at the chamber door. The spell between them shattered. "Your Majesties," a herald's voice called, crisp and unyielding, "Lord Valerius has invoked the ancient right of public decree. The council and the heads of all noble houses have been assembled in the grand hall." The finality in the herald's tone was absolute. This was it. There was no more time for secrets, no more room for private bargains or heartfelt confessions. They had to face their entire world and announce a decision that would either save the kingdom at an unbearable cost or condemn it to oblivion. Theron's hand fell to his side, and he looked at Ilara, his eyes a swirling tempest of duty, despair, and a terrifying, unspoken affection. Their crisis was no longer their own. It was about to become a public spectacle. They entered the grand hall not as rulers, but as defendants walking into their own trial. The air was thick and cold with the weight of 1,000 years of tradition and 1,000 hostile stares. Every noble house was present, their faces a gallery of grim judgment. Their silent disapproval, a physical force that pressed in on Ilara from all sides. Lord Valerius stood before the twin thrones, his posture one of triumphant righteousness, the architect of this public execution of their privacy. He had cornered them perfectly, using the kingdom's desperation as his weapon. Ilara felt Theron's hand brush against hers, a fleeting, almost imperceptible contact, yet it was an anchor in the storm of silent condemnation. She lifted her chin, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. But she would not let them see her break. They had come for a queen's submission. She would give them a survivor's defiance. Lord Valerius began to speak, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall, each word a carefully polished stone aimed at Theron's authority. He spoke of legacy, of the sacred duty of the crown, and of the ancient prophecy that was their only salvation. He painted a grim picture of their world turning to dust, of the prince fading into nothingness, all because of a king's sentimental hesitation. "The path is clear, though it may be difficult," Valerius declared, his gaze sweeping over the assembled nobles. "The prophecy demands a fusion of the bloodlines, an heir to secure our future. We are not asking for a sacrifice. We are demanding the fulfillment of a sacred contract. For the king to refuse is to place the life of one mortal above the eternal soul of our entire race. It is a weakness we can no longer afford." He had masterfully framed the debate, making Theron's choice one between love and duty, between Ilara and his entire world. All eyes turned to Theron, the silence in the hall so absolute it was a sound in itself. The weight of his kingdom, his lineage, and his son's life rested on his next words. He sat upon his crystal throne, a figure of immense, lonely power, the mask of the monarch firmly in place. His gaze swept over the expectant faces of his court, over the smug certainty on Valerius's face, and then, finally, it came to rest on Ilara. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in that single, profound moment, the entire world outside of them seemed to fade into shadow. The king, the prophecy, the dying land, it all fell away, leaving only the man and the woman. He saw not the key to a cure, but the fierce, defiant, mortal heart that had taught his own how to beat again. He had already made his choice in the quiet of his study. Now he would make it his legacy. Theron rose from his throne, his movement so fluid and deliberate, it commanded the attention of every being in the hall. "You are right, Lord Valerius," he began, his voice a low, dangerous calm that cut deeper than any shout. "The prophecy is our only salvation. But you have read the words and ignored the meaning." He descended the dais, not stopping until he stood directly before Ilara, turning his back on his council and his throne. "It speaks of a union to restore balance. For centuries, we have defined balance as power, as immortality, as control. We were wrong." He reached out and took Ilara's hand, lacing his fingers through hers in a gesture of absolute, unbreakable solidarity. True balance is a choice. It is the selfless act of placing a single, precious life above an eternity of empty survival. This kingdom is not dying from a blight, it is dying from a lack of heart. "I will not command her, I will not use her, and I will not sacrifice her freedom to perpetuate a legacy of arrogance," Theron declared, his voice ringing with the force of a breaking storm. He turned to face the stunned court, his arm protectively around Ilara's waist, pulling her to his side. My duty is not to a prophecy, but to her. I choose her." He then looked down at Ilara, his storm-grey eyes stripped of all pretense, revealing a depth of emotion so raw and powerful it stole her breath. "I love you," he whispered. The words meant for her alone, yet felt by the entire hall. "More than my crown, more than my life." As he spoke the words, a faint, emerald light bloomed from the center of the hall, a warmth spreading from the very stones. The blight was not a curse to be broken by a birth, but by an act of pure, selfless love. He sealed his vow with a kiss, a desperate, passionate claiming that was not for his court, but for himself, a promise that shattered their contract and forged a new destiny. Months later, from a high balcony in the spire, Ilara watched the first silver leaves unfurl on the branches of the ancient trees below, their healthy sheen a vibrant promise against the dawn sky. The blight was in full retreat, banished not by a ritual, but by a revolution of the heart. Beside her, Theron placed a warm hand over hers, his touch no longer a political statement, but a familiar, comforting presence. His son was awake. His kingdom was healing, and the oppressive silence of the spire had been replaced by a quiet, hopeful hum. There was no longer a chasm between their worlds, only a bridge they had built together, one of choice and devotion. He was no longer just her king, and she was no longer his cure. They were simply two souls who had found their anchor in one another against the tides of fate. Their journey had been forged in pain and prophecy, but their future would be one of their own making, a testament to a love powerful enough to heal a world. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel for more tales to come.